There you go. So we are going to record it, and so we will be making the video available as soon as we finish up on the link. So just to go back to what we were saying, then restore unsettling, but at the same time, Ted, you are the one who actually used very interesting terms when it comes to curating, partition. And you talked about this idea of transformative narratives, or partition as a transformative event. Can you tell us a bit more about this term in relation to your experience with the museum?
I mean, so what I can first say, and this is aligning a bit or connecting a bit with what Farrukh mentioned before about, the many layered histories, multiple histories that exist, and that jointly weave, let's say, the history of the partition. I mean, what we find in the museum space at the Partition Museum, which does something, I think, which is a step away from and a step beyond what the films do that Meera talked about before. Since it tries to base its account on actual work of historians, etc. What the museum still does is that it portrays and describes the partition, how it came about, how it occurred, and what happened after, in a very linear sense. So what you get as a visitor is an experience that is almost chronological. It's like walking through history. So there is a set narrative, and then you have interspersed throughout it confirmations in the form of oral histories that you listen to, Xerox actual archival documents that seem to verify and authenticate the story that is being told, so-called witness objects, so everyday objects that people traveled with when they went through the migration experience, or something that we can think about as going through a journey in itself as an object at the time of the partition. But all of these things that are interspersed throughout the exhibition, they seem to affirm and confirm the overall narrative that is being told. And that's, as I said, is almost like the experience of walking through history, but in a set, authoritative fashion. But when I think about just and to maybe reflect on some of the things that Meera was touching on before, what I find very concretely, what is challenging for someone who would like to curate the partition or create partition in India today, in contemporary India, in a museum setting, is that, I would say that it's very insufficient actually to only focus on India and to only focus on Indian visitors. Of course, at the museum, there's some Pakistani material, there's mentioning of Pakistan and so forth, but it's catering to an Indian audience or even a cosmopolitan audience. So Pakistan is not fully there. It's not a transnational initiative in that sense. And I think that's very difficult, actually, if you wish to curate the partition fully to work in this fashion. And then the second thing I want to just mention in relation to this is that, what we don't find at this museum space is the linkage between this past and today's India. So we don't see that link or that thread being drawn. And for me, this is a clear omission. And I can understand why it's not done, because it's very difficult in today's India to make that link. But what is the point of even thinking about what the partition stands for if we don't make use of that for thinking about India as a nation state, what Farrukh was talking about before, state relations between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. So to avoid or to stay away from connecting this past, the stories that are being told about the past, to present day events, I think that's a missing part as well. And then finally, I should just say, and this is what Meera is also, I think, is indicating in what she said before, it's very hard in today's India to stay away from controversy. And this is something that those working with the museum, they will constantly have to balance. And it's a very delicate balance, because if you speak about victims and perpetrators in a way that doesn't please everyone, especially influential, let's say, political, economic elites and so forth, I mean, maybe there will be a large-scale controversy stemming from that. So at the same time as I'm being, let's say, critical about what the Partition Museum is, I also see, I mean, what kind of situation and circumstances it is operating within. And also I would like to stress that it's a step forward in terms of making the partition justice from what the films are doing that Meera talked about before.
Ted, you know what? I was just wondering, and I'm really interested in this idea of, you know, when you speak about this narrative being anyway somehow the same old narrative, if you want. I wonder, and this connection between what it was before and what it is now. I wonder, and of course, museum and curators within museum have responsibilities in constructing those histories. And I have some issues with oral histories and what oral history does. I always feel that oral history is fascinating as well as limiting. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about oral histories being used as a shared responsibility within within a museum to kind of, you know, share the responsibility of what history needs to be said about partition.
So what I can say when I spontaneously think,
I mean, really,
that,
it's yeah.
No. So I can just say, let's say, just my spontaneous response is that, I mean, on the one hand, it makes it into very individualized experiences, and this is something that we've been missing up until a certain point, of course, in the literature on the partition, but that was something that changed from the 1990s and onwards. Maybe it was there in fiction, but in terms of anthropological work and so forth, these were some of the voices and stories that had to be told, and there's been a lot of important work done. But I think that what oral histories in a museum setting tend to do is that they individualize this experience, and that, of course, doesn't then allow maybe for connecting it to wider social and political dimensions here. But the second thing I would like to say is that if you look at the literature on oral history and those committing to oral history work, let's say fully, then there's a commitment also to think about the silences, the incoherences, the gaps in the accounts that we listen to, and what those might tell us. At the museum, because of the impatience of museum visitors, you know, they smoothen those accounts. So they edit the interviews and they shorten them. You don't hear the voice of the interviewer. You don't hear maybe the stutterings, murmurings, the incomplete accounts, etc. So I think that oral history as a method, I tend to like it when I read about it, when I read work done by historians and work in this fashion. But in a museum setting, you'll of course have to deal with impatient visitors, but then you lose some of its real true potential for awakening us to, you know, the incompleteness, the difficulty with telling this as a set narrative and so forth.
I do find memory studies, oral history incredibly fragile because of the fragility of memories and what memories can say and what they can do within an overall historical context and within a space as well, such as the one of an exhibition or a partition. So that fragility, I think it's something that we might, you know, we might have some thoughts about what do we do and how do we build partition. Meera and Farrukh, I come back to films actually, and I have a comment actually, like also what Ted was mentioning. So it seems as if we have museums, exhibition, certain kind of institutional space where histories and narratives are said in a certain way. Then there are films where there are more personal history, where there are some accounts of history as well. But there is a sense of compartmentalization of how partition is being curated. You have any thoughts around it?
The compartmentalization of films,
of how partition needs, needs to be made available, if you want.
Well, there are very many personal stories of partition, which, like Trade to Pakistan also, which have been put onto film. But if one thinks about the history of Indian film, it has always been influenced by some mythology or some ideology. So the earliest films, Raja Harishchandra was there in a kind of nationalist mood to prove that if you've got Jesus Christ, we've got Raja Harishchandra. We are also a civilization worth looking at, and worth standing on its own. Because the nationalist movement began by saying self-government is possible, and the colonialists said, no, you can't govern yourselves, you're not clever enough. So we are saying, no, we are an ancient civilization, and here we are, and the films are there to prove it. Then there was another phase of Gandhianism, right, where a kind of Gandhian philosophy set into films. So Achut Kanya, right, the untouchable girl, was made to prove that there shouldn't be any such thing as, that we're all human beings in that sense. Then Razia Begum was made to in the Gandhian era to try and prove that Muslims and Hindus are just as valuable and they're all Indians together, and so on. And it was only after partition, that the huge question was posed as to, okay, now we are free, but who the hell are we? And in my mind, that question was first answered by Raj Kapoor and his films. It was creating a new mythology for India. And the new mythology after partition, it was necessary to say, okay, we're independent, but who is independent? Who are we, right? To give a narrative, if you like, to India. And what Raj Kapoor was saying, कि जहाँ होठों पे सच्चाई होती है, दिल में सफाई होती है, हम उस देश के वासी है, जिस देश में गंगा बहती है. Now, the geography is all right, the Ganges does flow through India, but that, there's truth on all our lips and purity in all our hearts is probably not quite so true. But the mythology is there. And to give that mythology and say that we are a country in which the peasant is more truthful than the city slicker with a tie in his imitation colonial suit. So, Mera naam Raju, Gherana naam, I'm just a simple boatman, right? I'm just a simple boatman, but I am the hero. I am the soul of India. Yeah. And Raj Kapoor did that for the new mythology. And Nargis, when she broke from Raj Kapoor, did it with Mother India, saying that dharma, right, as expressed in the Mahabharata, as expressed by Krishna to Arjun, is more important than your son's future or your actions. So Mother India gave that mythology of who is Indian woman to us.
Yeah. Meera, do you have any comments around this idea of the films that somehow enable, how to say, different really history, but different ways of building ideas around partition than what, for instance, a museum space can do?
Yes, definitely. I think every time we talk about the partition or we think about the partition, we look at partition literature, and then we look at the films that we have that have been made on this particular event. And of course, what I have sort of understood from this is that memories, like you were talking about, the memories are subjective. You can build a narrative around an individual story, or you can make it into a political drama or a historical drama where you really go into the facts of why partition happened and what led to the events that took place, and you kind of try and make it into a factual narrative. But usually in cinema, that's what I have looked at, especially Indian cinema, like what Farrukh was also talking about. There is an inherent way that we dramatize and that we, whether it's the songs or whether it's the melodrama. So there is that inherent particular way in which we tell our stories, and that also comes from a particular kind of cinematic tradition. And within that tradition, what we say about the partition has also over a period of time become complicated. In the past, we had narratives like Garam Hawa, we had a Tamas, which were clear adaptations of a literary work, or you had a Pinjar, or, so it was, you could just, it was easier to look at these stories and present these stories as because they were adaptations. But as we're moving into contemporary cinema, we're looking at more fiction narratives that are coming along. So we're giving, these mainstream heroes or protagonists, we're giving them backstories of partition. That this is where they've come from. Very recently, there's this Marvel comic hero, Kamala Khan, which is in the news at this point, that she also has a partition history where, her parents were Indian Muslims and they come back and, that. So I'm just saying that a lot of times partition tends to become, especially in contemporary cinema, it tends to become a backstory that this is where this person came from, this is the trauma he or she experienced, and this was, or maybe this is a nostalgic aspect that they, look back on because of that's their history. So it's somewhere in that area of representation in contemporary cinema. That's my take, that it's sort of, and it's easier to treat it like a backstory, because then it's it's something you leave behind. You don't carry it forward in the present or in the future, and so it's not that complicated, to represent in whichever socio-political situation you are in. So you don't create that much of a controversy. It's the past, and you have a thread tying you to it, but you don't actively unravel that. That thread. That's what I've been seeing in whatever I have studied so far. So
that's perfect. Meera, I want to take on something. I think it's a final point really and it's a question for everyone about something you mentioned at the very beginning, which is the use of, or rather the digital world. And I wonder, what does the digital to partition, and that is true for for spaces like museum, for films. How do you think digital is somehow helping to build new ways of thinking or building partition or undoing that? This is a question for all of you. Who wants to go ahead? Meera, I'll ask you to start then, as you were the one suggesting it.
Well, I think digital space is at this point, I would say it's a very complicated space now, because it allows for a lot of content, but at the same time, there's very little critical perspective given to that content. So there's no critical context to a lot of the content that is being made out there. So it's very easy to just make something like what Ted had also talked about. You make a museum, but when you don't give it that critical perspective, it just stays on the surface. So it's a surface level reading of something, or you just present something that just seems to hint at a few things, but you don't really delve more into it. So I think the digital space offers you a lot of surface level readings, and it allows you to create content that might not have any substance in that sense. So, and because it's so immediate and it's so fast that it spreads, and you can spread small tiny snippets. So now you don't really need to go into a 3 hour or 2.5 hour narrative. You just you actually condense history into like a 2.5 minute or a 1 minute reel or a 1 minute video. It's become that fast, and there's that much content out there. So I think it has scope, but I think at this point, as I see it, there's a lot of condensation, and there's a lot of just putting in 3-4 facts and a few images. You make that into one small snippet, and then you're good to go. So I think that thing with the digital world right now that I'm seeing, it's more concerning, because it really doesn't allow for any in-depth understanding of what issue they're actually talking about. So that is a bit concerning for me.
Ted, have you got any ideas or any comment about it, or reviews?
Oh, so I mean, I'm just being triggered by the word digital, and then I just say anything I'm thinking of. So I mean, first of all, I haven't been able to go to India since the pandemic started. So I mean, maybe this has changed at the museum, but I mean, one thing that surprised me was that they didn't even allow visitors to take photographs. And knowing, I mean, how much of a visual culture, and I mean, that we want to click and like and share things, that was something that surprised me, that the museum is this kind of old-fashioned type of museum, almost. So that was just a very brief reflection here, that the Partition Museum didn't seem to tap into its full digital potential. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I wouldn't know, because it could also, of course, augment this as a tourist experience, and for young people to demonstrate that they've been places. But then, as you know, Monia, too, there's this, as I mentioned before, there's a digital archive of oral histories. I mean, on their website, they're claiming that they have, I don't know, 10,000 or so oral histories collected, but they've only made available or accessible a few of these. I don't know, maybe 20, 30, 40, something. I can't remember the exact number, but not the full extent of what they have. Yeah. So maybe there is a potential in this becoming a fully digitally available archive, both for, I mean, lay persons and academics. And thus there's a lot of potential, of course, in that. But let's see and await what happens with that in the future. But just a final thought. I mean, I said before that, I mean, I think there's a basic dilemma or problem with having a partition museum exclusively in India. And I mean, why do we even need a physical museum? If we can't set it on the border as in Toba Tek Singh, I mean, because that doesn't seem to be practically possible. Maybe someone at least could have or offer also a transnational museum in a digital space. That's a possibility. Maybe there's already such initiatives out there, but I haven't seen them yet. But that would at least allow for complicating the picture about, let's say, shared Punjabi histories and culture and so forth. But those are just some reflections on this. And then maybe to push it back to you a bit, Monia, I know that you told me that you're setting up an archive of your own. Yeah. And there you're very much concerned with having a co-creative element, so that those who work with it, who encounter it, see it, that they're also part of creating it. So maybe that's something that you could tell the rest of us a bit more about.
Well, I wish, because it's everything in becoming, really. This is an archive that literally it was something that was going down to the trash, because it was an archive which the distributor at the time was getting rid of, and clearly there was no cultural value embedded in that, at least from the point of view of a distributor. For us, for me as someone who works with archive, this had an immense potential. And each image within the archive, it's a potential for me to engage with people and to build their stories around that film, which not necessarily are the same stories for everyone. So that that co-creativeness, or even that multi-location of, for instance, spaces that can generate new stories. To me, it's essential. So I come to what you were saying before, having, for instance, a museum or a space away from India, which can tell us more about the history of partition or partition around film, is essential. Same is with this, for instance, with this archive, to have a space where we can have a, if you want, tangible testimony of cinema traveling beyond the boundaries of India, as well as having people being able to digitally, because that's what's going to be the work that we will be doing, to digitally, I would say, fill some of the gaps, or rather layer further the archive, complicating further what an archive is and is not. I hope this makes sense. Yeah, so this is what really, for me, what the digital can do. It can possibly supply something else, but it can also problematize the overall existence of an archive and how we access that. In fact, as you were both writing, or rather, as you were both talking, the term access was for me the key term of both your discussions, how we access partition, and how different forms of partition that is kind of core at the moment. And that is, Meera was talking about something that it's easy and quick to consume. So partition becomes almost a fragment of some kind of moment in history, but of course losing a lot more layers. Ted, of course, once again, you were mentioning the possibility of an online, of a digital museum, which would be great. And that, once again, would be complicating what partition is. I come to Farrukh. What would you like the digital world to do for partition, if at all?
If one looks at the advance of technology, obviously what they've said, about access is 1000% true. You see, you sit on the train and everybody's fooling with their iPhones, and obviously even wars in Russia and Ukraine are being affected by people getting information from the outside. So technology makes things possible, but the one thing it does also makes possible is art. Mm-hmm. Art can progress through technological innovation, as you now see when you put on those specs and you go into a real world. I'm sure that there will be, with the advance of technology, there'll be different ways of telling stories. Mm-hmm. And different stories will emerge from the fact that there is a new technology which makes things possible. Mm-hmm. It's happened before. The Upanishads were all told by father to son in the Brahmin caste. Before there were books, then technology was invented, and then there was writing, and then there were books. Yeah. And then there was printing, so lots of people could read it instead of just being a manuscript. It became a printed book and everybody read it. So we've seen that kind of progress, and the possibilities expanding. And I'm absolutely sure that will give rise to not only, of course, partition is it has 100 stories there. Yeah. And some artist, some creator, some writer will get working on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was a bit of a conclusion of our conversation. I really wanted to have some perspective and some ideas about what does it mean to curate. And to that I never have any answer, because curating, it's so complicated. It's such a layered a practice that it's very much, I think, all of what we have been saying is to build narrative, is to undo narrative, is to imagine new space, is to engage with technology. And I like that we all, we have been raising common, if you want, problem that curating or curating for partition can can bring, from telling stories, from memories, from oral histories, and finally to conclude with access and accessing, or even generating new stories of partition, is what possible curatorship can do for us. And it was really lovely to be, as I said, in conversation with all of you, to kind of have ideas to share, really, more than answers to give. So I will stop the recording. I know we will be staying on for a couple of minutes, but this will be uploaded on the YouTube link, Creative Archives of Indian Cinema, and I shall share the link with everyone.